Section 66 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 8, Spheres of Action, Miscellaneous Business, Chapter 16, Part 6. In their general hostility to the Inquisition, the Aragonese kingdoms objected to this extension of its jurisdiction. There were complaints by the Cortes, and in the various Concordias and settlements there were concessions secured which gave to the secular judges some participation in the trials. Into the details of these more or less temporary arrangements it is scarce worth while to enter, except to mention that, in the struggle which resulted in the Concordia of 1646, Aragon gained the point that the crime was recognized as mixti fori, to be tried by either the secular court or the Inquisition, according to priority in commencing action, and that familiars were included in this. The current practice may be gathered from the answers of Valencia and Saragossa in response to inquiries by the Suprema in 1573. In Valencia, arrest was accompanied by sequestration, but not in Aragon, where the crime did not entail confiscation. In Aragon, when a new inquisitor was inducted, the papal briefs were presented to him and he accepted them, and all sentences commenced by qualifying the inquisitors as jueces comisarios apostolacos para conocer en el crimen de sodomía, showing that this was a special jurisdiction. The routine of procedure in the two tribunals did not vary much. The process was somewhat simpler than in heresy trials. The accused was allowed ample means of defense in counsel, advocates and procurators. Witnesses' names were not suppressed, except in Valencia, when the accused was of high rank, in which case the Suprema was consulted. After the publication of evidence, the procurator had the right to examine the witnesses. The Concordia of 1568 had provided that convicts should not appear in autos, but in Aragon this was left to the discretion of the tribunal, which generally exhibited them there. These reports make no allusion to the concurrence of secular judges, but the practice may be gathered from a letter of Philip II, March 17, 1575, to the Captain General of Catalonia, where it appears that when a convict was relaxed, the royal court demanded to see the papers of the case before pronouncing sentence. This the king pronounced to be wholly wrong, and ordered the custom of Valencia and Aragon to be followed, that when a case was ready for decision, the inquisitors notified the Captain General, who delegated judges to take part in the consulta, after which the sentence was to be executed without further examination. Torture was freely employed even on the testimony of a single accomplice. This raised a question in Aragon, where the use of torture was forbidden, as the trials were to be conducted in accordance with municipal law, but the Inquisition replied that the brief of Clement VII had been applied for at the request of the secular judges, who had found themselves unable to convict for lack of torture, and desired for that reason the Inquisition to have jurisdiction, the truth of which assertion may well be doubted. In 1636 there was raised a question as to torturing witnesses who revoked, but it was decided in the negative. Punishment varied with time and place. In Aragon, spontaneous confession was encouraged by simply reprimanding the culprit, warning him and ordering him to confess sacramentally, and this was confirmed by the Suprema in a decree of August 6, 1600. In Valencia, however, self-denunciation was visited with scourging and galleys, and if testimony of accomplices supervened, with relaxation. For those accused and regularly convicted, the statutory and ordinary punishment was burning. When in 1577 the Captain General of Valencia had some hesitation as to his duty in the case of two culprits relaxed to him by the Inquisition, Philip II ordered him to execute them promptly, and as late as 1647, in an auto at Barcelona, one was garroted and burnt. Yet, on the whole, there seems to have been a disinclination to relax these offenders, who could not escape, as heretics could, by confession and conversion. In 1616 we find the Suprema asking the Valencia tribunal why it had not confiscated the estate of Dr. Perez, convicted of this crime, and in 1634 it inquires whether there is any fuero prohibiting the pena ordinaria, when guilt has been fully proved and the offender is of full age. About 1640 an experienced inquisitor informs us that in Saragossa the penalty for those over 25 was relaxation, for minors scourging and the galleys, but he adds that this is not observed. He had seen many thus convicted and condemned to relaxation, but the Suprema always commuted the penalty. Ecclesiastics seem to have been regarded as entitled to especial leniency. In 1684 the Suprema called to account the Valencia tribunal for its benignity in a case of this kind, when it replied in much detail. Two decrees of Pius V in 1568, it said, had prescribed relaxation with preliminary degradation in the case of priests, and in 1574 the tribunal had so treated the case of a subdeacon. Many authorities, however, held that clerics were not to be subjected to the rigor of the law for this offence, and it was the common opinion that incorrigibility was required to justify the ordinary penalty. This had been the practice in Valencia, especially since 1615, when a priest was convicted of a single act and by order of the Suprema was sentenced to an extraordinary penalty. This had since been followed in various cases, so that clerics were not relaxed unless incorrigible, and this was defined to be when repeated punishment showed that the Church could not reform them. This argument, moreover, precluded the use of torture, which, as the tribunal pointed out, could be used only when the penalty was worse than torture. The case which called forth this explanation affords a very instructive example of the advantage to justice of an open trial, with opportunity of cross-examination. The accused was Fray Manuel Sanchez del Castellar y Arbustan, a distinguished member of the Order of La Merced. The trial had lasted for nearly 3 years when the papers were submitted to the Suprema in August 1684. There were 2 accomplice witnesses to consummated acts, others to solicitation, others to lascivious and filthy actions, and others to general foul reputation. Under the ordinary inquisitorial process, condemnation would have been inevitable, but repeated examinations and cross-examinations revealed discrepancies and contradictions and variations, and a knowledge of the witnesses enabled the accused to present evidence of enmities. The conclusion reached by the tribunal was that nearly the whole mass of evidence was the result of a conspiracy embracing a number of frailes of the convent, incited by jealousy of the honors and position obtained by Sanchez. Still, there was some testimony as to indiscretions which was not rebutted, and as there had been a great scandal requiring a victim, with customary inquisitorial logic, he was sentenced to 4 years' exile from Valencia, Orihuela and Madrid, for the first 2 of which he was deprived of active and passive voice, of confessing and preaching, and of all honors in his order. In this, consideration was given to 3 years spent in prison, so that, if innocent, he had suffered severely, and was sent forth branded with an ineffaceable stigma, while, if guilty, he had a penalty far less than his deserts. When the Suprema asked why the two witnesses to complicity were not prosecuted, the tribunal replied that they were regarded as spontaneously confessing, and it was not customary to prosecute in such cases. Besides, although their enmity and contradictions invalidated their testimony, these were insufficient to justify prosecution for false witness. Altogether it was an unpleasant business, which the tribunal evidently desired to dispatch with as little damage as possible to the Church. The tendency towards leniency increased with time and was shown to laymen as well as to ecclesiastics. In 1717 the Barcelona tribunal sentenced Guillaume Amiel, a Frenchman, to 4 years of presidio and perpetual banishment from Spain. The Suprema commuted the presidio to 100 lashes, but when the sentence was read, Amiel protested that his father was a gentleman and that he held a patent as teniente del rey cristianissimo, thus claiming exemption from degrading corporal punishment. The proceedings were suspended and the Suprema was consulted, which omitted the lashes, and on the same account the boy Ramon Gil, who was the accomplice, was spared the vergüenza to which he had been condemned. The most conspicuous case of this nature in the annals of the Inquisition was that of Don Pedro Luis Galceran de Borja, Grand Master of the Order of Montesa. He was not only a grandee of Spain, but was allied to the royal house. He was half brother to Francisco de Borja, Duke of Grandia, and subsequently general of the Jesuits, and was of kin to nearly all the noblest lineages of the land. For his arrest in 1571 the assent of Philip II was necessary. He was not confined in the secret prison, but had commodious apartments from which, during his trial, he conducted the affairs of the order. He claimed exemption on the ground of the privileges of the order, and more than 2 years were spent in debating the question, though it was pointed out that, while the Trinitarians had even greater privileges, 2 members professed of that order had recently been relaxed for the same crime, and Borja was not even a cleric, but a married man with children. The claim was finally disallowed, and the trial went slowly on. The evidence reduced itself to 2 singular witnesses, who testified to solicitation and attempt, and to one, Martin de Castro, who testified to consummation and then revoked. Powerful influence from all quarters was brought to bear to save the accused, and in the final consulta de fe there was discordia. 2 inquisitors and the Ordinary voted for acquittal. The other inquisitor, who was Juan de Rojas, in a written opinion called for 4 years of exile and a heavy fine. The Suprema, after prolonged correspondence with the tribunal, accepted this, but changed the exile to 6 years of reclusion in his convent of Montesa. Llorente intimates that the inquisitors expected to gain bishoprics, or at least places in the Suprema, and that a bargain was made through which, on Borja's death, the order of Montesa was incorporated with the crown, as the military orders of Castile had been under Ferdinand. To this latter some color was lent by Philip's appointment of Borja's natural son to the grand commandership of the order, from which he rose to the cardinalate. There is an evident allusion to this case in the remark of an Italian traveller in 1593, who, when speaking of the severity of the Inquisition in these matters, illustrates it by the story of a grandee who, for merely throwing his arm around the neck of a page, spent 10 years in prison and 50,000 ducats. Cases were sufficiently frequent to give the Aragonese tribunals considerable occupation, especially after it was included in the Edict of Faith in 1574 as a crime to be denounced. I have but a few scattering data, but they are suggestive. Thus, in Saragossa, at the auto of June 6, 1585, there were 4 culprits relaxed. In Catalonia, in 1597, the report by Inquisitor Heredia of a visitation through the Sea of Tarragona, and parts of those of Barcelona, Vich, and Urgel, contained 68 cases of all kinds, and of these 15 were for this class of offences, though most of them were subsequently suspended. In Valencia there appeared in the autos, from January 1598 to December 1602, 27 of these culprits, of whom 7 were frailes. As it was customary to read the sentences con meritos, the populace had an edifying education. From 1780 to 1820 the total number of cases coming before the 3 tribunals was exactly 100. Section 66.